Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We are waiting for others to join, so we'll get started really shortly. Thanks for your patience. So, Orley, and where are you today? Are you in Princeton?
I'm in Princeton, New Jersey. Yeah, in my active home.
Fantastic. And Barbara, are you over at CERGE?
Currently, I'm at CERGE, if you ask about my physical presence, but I do work at the Charter University currently.
Fantastic. And I'm also in Prague, but not in the building right now. So we have 33 people who've joined so far. We'll just give it one more minute and then we'll get started, everybody. It's looking good. Why don't we just jump right in? So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Bryan, and I'm the Vice Chair of the CERGE-EI Foundation. I'll be your moderator today, and I'm joined by Barbara Pertold-Gebická, who's a CERGE-EI alumna and an instructor in our distance learning program, and of course by our very special guest, Professor Orley Ashenfelter. Our call today is part of the Distance Learning Program, a speaker series run by the CERGE-EI Foundation. This webinar is going to be recorded if you're interested in listening to it after the call. But before we get started, I'd like to note that we've gathered together a few questions already, and we really encourage you to add your question to the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. We're delighted to have 26 countries represented with attendees from 24 universities. We'd love to hear where you're from, so please introduce yourself in the chat box. Let us know where you're calling in from and what you're studying. And now more about our speaker. Our speaker today is Professor Orley Ashenfelter. He's a Princeton professor, a CERGE-EI Foundation board member, and a former ESC member for CERGE-EI. Professor Orley Ashenfelter is the Joseph Douglas Green 1895 Professor of Economics at Princeton University. He's a member of the advisory board at the Institute for Economic Policy Research at Stanford. He's a president of the American Association of Wine Economists and of many more organizations. He's involved in many more organizations as well. He was the director of the Office of Evaluation of the U.S. Department of Labor, where he started using quantitative methods for program evaluation. And he's made major contributions, not only in the field of labor economics, but also in econometrics and law and economics. He was one of the very first economists to use natural experiments in economics, and this has become universal across the social sciences, and is the co-author of the Big Mac Index, which measures a country's wealth based on a McDonald worker's average wage and the cost of a Big Mac. Since the early 1990s, Professor Ashenfelter has been actively engaged in the restoration of economics and education in the Czech Republic and Central and Eastern Europe, serving on the Executive and Supervisory Committee of CERGE-EI from 2001 to 2007, and as a member of the Board of Directors of the CERGE-EI Foundation since 1999. So please join me, everyone, in welcoming Professor Ashenfelter. Professor, we'd love to hear your perspective today on, before we get started with questions, on developments in the field of labor economics. What's your take on how it's changed over the course of time? For example, what were the topics that defined the field at the start of your career? What do you see as key today, and how do you foresee that the field will continue to develop? We'd love to just hear an update from you.
Well, labor economics has a quite long history, and probably its current development is a result of things that happened mainly in the 1940s and after. But there were people working in the labor economics field prior to that. Probably the most famous is John Hicks, who was British and wrote a book called The Theory of Wages. Nobel Prize winner many, many years ago, and no longer with us. But the modern evolution of the field started in the 1940s, heavily influenced by the Second World War and the fact that a great deal had to be sacrificed, and that working between labor and management to make sure that strikes and other conflicts didn't occur. became a kind of a fundamental interest. So around that time, there were several different schools, in fact, they're often called industrial relations. The group I'm in is the industrial relations section. It's actually labor economics and industrial relations, the two. So the beginning, I would say the earliest work often had to do with trade unions and their influence in the economy. And that then evolved over time to become quite a different subject. So I would say that was the first step. The second step was one thing about labor economics, it's always been very quantitative subject. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is one of our two American primary statistical agencies, actually predates the Department of Labor. There was an interest in statistics about workers and how they were faring even before there was a government agency that was associated with the labor market. So it was always quantitative. It became much more sophisticated in the next generation. So there was a kind of first generation of labor economists, and then there was a sort of a second generation of labor economists. They're much more quantitative, use more modern methods, and the subjects branched out into much more detailed, different topics. For example, my own dissertation, which is back in the 1970s, was essays on racial discrimination in the labor market. So the very first economist, modern economist, to work on that kind of topic, differences by gender or race or whatever, was an early labor economist, Gary Becker, no longer with us, also Nobel Prize winner. So topics like that then became much more important in the field. And it eventually evolved to the point where studying income differences and poverty, for example, became a kind of a key entrant in the subject. I used to have a teacher many years ago who always described the field as a mile wide and an inch deep, which is kind of a way of saying that many, many topics are included in the field of labor economics. Often, I think, because other economists are uncomfortable dealing with them. Gender differences and race differences are a pretty good example, but there are quite a few others that many issues about unemployment, for example, and precisely what unemployment means they're not familiar to the topics really for many other fields of economics. So this has kind of evolved to the point where last year, in fact, there was sort of the way empirical methods evolved was resulted in a Nobel Prize for several shared Nobel Prize among several people, two of whom were my students actually years ago. So now I think that there's a kind of a sense in which the use of empirical methods, transparent empirical methods, has become very common in economics generally. And that's really spread from what was at one time primarily something that was done by labor economists. So the topics have broadened out and the methods have slightly broadened out too, to evolve to incorporate lots of different topics. That's an overview. How about that?
Oh, thank you so much. So, it's interesting that you started, working on racial discrimination in the labor market. And it's very apropos now. And I was kind of wondering, how has the method of looking at racial discrimination, how has it changed?
That's interesting. It's a difficult for economists. The idea of discrimination is implies that something is being that there are differences that are prevailing that are not strictly based on income maximization or profit maximization. So the introduction of people's preferences over who they work with or who works for them it's been quite revolutionary, and it's still not completely agreed upon. But the labor economists became important in the field in that area, especially for quantitative and measurement reasons. So originally, how did that happen? Well, it happened mainly because of the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act in the United States. There was there have been several moments, epiphanies, you might say, where the American public kind of suddenly takes account of things. 1964 was the first one, and I think, and it led to laws that made discrimination illegal. Now, at the beginning, discrimination was quite overt. For example, in the South, in a paper mill, there would be two lines of progression on the seniority ladder. So Black workers came in the door and they worked in certain jobs and could progress to a certain level. And white workers came in a different door and could do the same thing. That was also true with respect to gender. So for example, in the 1950s, if a woman applied for a job at what was then our telephone monopoly, AT&T, the woman went into the door that made her a telephone operator. And the highest position to which she could aspire would be the chief of the telephone operators. Whereas when the men went in the door, they could start off as a lineman or a switcher helper, but they were very proud of the fact that they could rise from that position all the way to president of the company. So these were very explicit distinctions that were built into the structure. It's surprising when you think about it that never occurred to anyone that this was not a rational way to behave, right? Certainly some women could have done jobs that men were doing and might even have done it more cost effectively. So that was the beginning. And then that sort of discrimination disappeared. You don't have the same sort of overt, explicit discrimination anymore. But that doesn't mean there isn't something like a discrimination going on. And so then that became a measurement problem. If there are differences between Blacks and whites or men and women or whatever, how do we know that those differences are not due to the productivity of the workers involved? In other words, could it be the case that those differences were explicable by objective criteria that are not discriminatory? That's what the courts had to cope with. So lots of labor economists, the work that had been done in labor economics was done before the law was passed. So, but then when the law was passed, all the tools that were needed were suddenly there. So that's an example of how it changed. I don't think since that time, it hasn't changed so much. The original tools were there. One of the first examples is one that almost all labor economists know the name of one. Actually, one of my former students, Ronald Oaxaca, which is very hard for people to understand. That's a province in Mexico, and Ron is a Mexican American, but that province, that word is not Spanish. It's actually an Indian word for the name of that province. He invented a method that's used everywhere. They call them Oaxaca differentials. In fact, if you go to the statistical package that many people use, Stata, there's actually a command in there, the Oaxaca command. You can tell the computer to study these pay differentials automatically. So it's kind of an interesting evolution to the point where it's become more or less commonplace. And that way of decomposing things is used not just with respect to males and females, but it can be used with respect to all kinds of other differences that may persist in the labor market. That just so happens that methodology is useful for studying them.
Well, thank you. That's really interesting. So Barbara's going to ask our next question. Go ahead, Barbara.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, you talked about all the methods that were developed over time, and actually last year Nobel Prize was acknowledging this evolution of methodology. So could you maybe talk a bit more about the empirical methods, identification methods that evolved over time and that are used currently in labor economics?
You mean the methods? Is that what you're thinking of, or what do you mean?
Yes, I mean about identifying some causal relationships. The relationship, well, with gender or race is exogenously given, is given to a person, but then labor economics also deal with education, how education affects wages, how the way where you live or your job is remunerated.
Okay, so there are a lot of other topics that's obviously when I teach, for example, I normally teach about labor demand, what determines a labor supply, and then we talk about human capital. So that's another kind of revolution that took place that was mostly associated with labor economics. The idea of treating not just schooling, but lots of other things, training and so on, as investments. There was a lot of resistance to that in the beginning. The idea that these things were investments. I think because some people are repelled by the idea that you would think of making an investment in college or in a training program based on the benefits and the costs, as opposed to simply investing in education because you like to read books or something. In fact, now that's sort of a common model. And so what's then happened was the origin was the interest in the payoff to schooling. It's probably the origin, and then trying to measure that. So that became quite an important topic, and then that's become a whole subject. So as often happens, the economics of education is now an entire subject matter, and lots of economists spend time on quite detailed analyses, for example, of school choice, whether or not choice systems actually lead to better outcomes for students, anything, class size, other things like that may or may not influence them. The way you ask the question makes me think about the way I structure a course that I teach. So human capital is probably the most successful accomplishment empirically in the field. It's certainly the case that if you look at the return to schooling almost everywhere in the world, that's an empirical regularity that schooling levels are correlated with income and pay levels. That's a regularity that's maybe steeper relationship in some countries than in others, but it's something that happens everywhere. But then I also teach, so there are other topics that I go into as well. Another important topic that has evolved recently is immigration. There was little interest in that in the beginning of the quantitative methods in labor economics, and now immigration has become quite an important topic. Unfortunately, so we have a model of immigration, which is also based on investments in you think of your migrating as an investment in capital too. But in that kind of I think we have made some success with that. The difficulty, of course, is that there are all kinds of barriers to immigration. So most people are not able to move for simply because of the fact that they can make more income. And there clearly are people who don't want to make those moves. For a good example, one example I always give is the United States is the territory of Puerto Rico. A lot of people don't know this. The US has several territories. A territory is not a state. And in fact, when someone lives in Puerto Rico, they don't pay US income taxes. They pay Puerto Rican taxes. They cannot vote in American elections. However, if they depart, they don't need a passport to leave Puerto Rico. You can just simply get on an airplane and fly to New York. Some people call them, Puerto Ricans are often called New Yorkans. They can move there and then they can vote. They can run for office and do everything exactly as if they were an American. So when they're inside the United States, they're Americans. But when they're in Puerto Rico, they're Puerto Ricans. Now that means that they have completely free migration. And yet there are still quite substantial pay differences between Puerto Rico and the US. So clearly there are some other factors that go into decisions about where people are going to locate. And then most important in the case of migration is, I'm afraid, everyone has seen pictures of these things. Much migration now is no longer inspired by economics. It's a non-economic problem. For example, it's the same organization, the UN High Commission for Refugees is the same organization that dealt with refugees after the Second World War. There are probably 50 million people at risk. There are 10 million people in camps in the Middle East. This is migration that's very difficult to think of as an economist. It's not really about economics. And then I usually talk about other subjects, trade unions, as another topic that this is a much bigger topic in some countries than others, except in the public sector. The union movement has, it's not very strong in the United States. There are very small fraction of workers in the private sector belong to trade unions or have bargaining, which is covered by trade unions. That's quite different from what it is. Even in our northern brother, the Canadians, have a much higher rate of unionization than we do. So that has become probably less interesting for American economists, but it's quite interesting for economists in Europe and elsewhere in the world. The way trade unions operate is fascinating. These are collective organizations. In a way, they're like governments. So they have to have enough unity in order to be able to get by. And so the study of union objectives and how they work has always been a original topic in labor economics. So that's kind of a rundown of the topics, I would say. Normally when I teach labor economics, I teach what I call the core subjects: supply, demand, and human capital, pay off to schooling, and then I take up other applications. There are more. I mean, there are other possible topics too. So, for example, the role of labor in international trade is a topic I sometimes try to cover. And of course, there's also the big issue now, in some countries anyway, is unemployment and precisely what it means. There's been the pandemic, of course, created this remarkable spike in unemployment, which then has disappeared. So the labor market right now is a very complicated matter. And I think that's true in most countries that went through the pandemic. And if they didn't go through the pandemic, they're going through it now. So that's another, and there's been a lot of energy put into trying to understand what the pandemic effects are. So, I mean, the economy right now, the strange thing about it is real growth is very negligible. Inflation is relatively high and unemployment is quite low. It's not a combination of things that we normally see. So there are a lot of people trying to figure out what happened there. I don't think anybody really knows the answer. So that's work that's still in progress.
Thank you so much. And We have another question that's going back to our original topic of discrimination, but just a little bit of a broader focus. And it's a question from our audience. Abdullah Hoti, who's from the University of Pristina, asks, can you please discuss how labor market discrimination has changed in the light of the increased competition for jobs in the global context? So especially in the service industry, how has the labor market discrimination impacted global worker economy?
Well, real genuine discrimination, which is based on where people are exercising preferences, it means that there's some inefficiency created in the sense that some workers who could do the jobs more cost effectively are not being employed. We like to think that competitive pressure will result in decreases in discrimination because in other words, the simple example is if there's someone who is non-discriminatory, they'll be more efficient, cost effective. And so increased competition hopefully would cause the discrimination to be reduced. However, there's lots of evidence that doesn't always happen. The barriers are extremely difficult to break down, and once they've started. So it's unclear. I'm not sure that labor market discrimination has really been influenced very much by international trade or by investments. Typical example is when it used to be there was a rather substantial wage difference between the North and the South in the U.S. When I was a student, we used to study the North-South wage differential. Well, it's mostly gone, that wage differential. But it was always the case that when Northern companies, where discrimination was not so strong, invested in the South, they often followed the same habits as the companies that were already there. It's difficult to break out of what people think of as normal behavior. So I'm not at all convinced that competition by itself is enough to break down barriers that exist with respect to, of course, the discrimination is an issue. It's different in different places. So, it may be gender in one place, and it might be race in another. It might be an ethnic group in another. It might be a caste in another. There are all kinds of ways that people could have preferences exercised against them.
Barbara, would you like to ask the next question?
Yes, thank you for your optional talk. Yeah, so I was wondering, you developed this MAC wage index that compared real wages across countries or across regions within a country. What can be followed using that index? What insights do you get from that?
It's very, this was this is work I've done with Stefan Ureta, who's of course in Prague. And we started on this work really, at least I got interested in it a long time ago now, 20 years ago, because it was so difficult to make comparisons across countries. And that's where it got started. So I was interested in it. In fact, originally, my original interest was in India. I was visiting India. I had done some work there. And I had a former student. Indians like to argue about poverty a lot. They are constantly measuring it and so on. And wonderful country, by the way. Actually, I enjoyed every time I was there, everything about the place. But it's poor. It's a poor country. And so one day there was all these arguments. And I said, well, wait. I said to this student, do you have McDonald's here? And the guy, oh yes, we have McDonald's. Okay, great. So how much does a worker at McDonald's make? And he said, I don't know. Let's go find out. So we went and had lunch. I still have the receipt from the lunch that I had. I had I still remember it. I had a Maharaja Mac, which is in those days, it was, there's a taboo about beef. So in those days, it was made from lamb. It's really quite a good burger. I thought. Now they make it from a chicken product. But so I had a Maharaja Mac, and then we went to the restaurant, and it looked like an American restaurant. I mean, there were no Americans, of course. It was 100% Indians, run by Indians. And then my friend, so we had our meal, and I always try to get a Big Mac and a shake and French fries. I consider that a full meal. Anyway, we had this meal. And then my friend said, well, let's go talk to the manager. So we went and talked to the manager. A lot of people in India speak English. And the manager showed us into the kitchen. We went into the kitchen. And the kitchen looked just exactly like the kitchen would be anywhere. So it was very, very meticulously clean. Everything was taken care of. And I thought suddenly, this is amazing that these people are doing exactly the same thing. The workers are doing exactly the same thing as workers would do in the US or in Prague or anywhere. And we visited one in Prague. My favorite McDonald's actually is in Prague. It's in a listed building. I mean, it's the most beautiful, astonishing, really, to go to a McDonald's in a listed building. Anyway, that we visited several, and then I suddenly thought, this is fantastic. This is a completely, and then I learned about it. So that's a completely homogeneous product, and the product, the Big Mac is the same everywhere, pretty much, and the workers do exactly the same thing. So this was an opportunity to get a comparison that was clean. It was very straightforward and transparent. So we started collecting data across countries. Now, it's not always possible. Some countries don't have McDonald's, but unless you're a very poor country, you will probably have it. The biggest problem is electricity. Much of the food is frozen that's sent into a McDonald's. So, and now we actually collect data in the US. So we now have data that are collected in the United States from almost every McDonald's. So we can actually see what differences there are. Differences across countries when I first started doing this back after the year 2000, divergence between countries started to disappear. It didn't disappear completely, but where you can see that China has really grown is when you look at what a person, by the way, I've had a Big Mac in China. I had it in Beijing. It's just the same, it was fine. It's kind of an expensive product for a Chinese guy, but it was fine. So so I've had them in India and China and lots of places. In fact, I usually have a deal I make when I talk about this, that if we like to check the data that we do. So if you have a meal somewhere and you send me the receipt, I'll pay for your McDonald's meal. So we now have learned that there are these differences. They're quite persistent. The divergence started to close. China is really the one country that has had phenomenal growth. Most countries have not, and the convergence has basically stopped with the Great Recession. So I think we've learned some things from it. And now what we've been doing is studying inside the US. It's a place where for example, you can study the determinants of wages at a micro-type level. There's a recent paper we've been studying where we looked at, Stefan and I looked at the effect of minimum wages on wage rates at McDonald's. It's quite interesting. There are now a lot of different minimum wages in the US. Different states have them, different cities have them. And what's interesting is, it didn't used to be the case, but it is now, that there's clearly an attempt by the restaurants to maintain, in some cases, a premium over what the minimum wage would require them to pay. And that is not totally consistent with a classical economic model where you pay workers as little as you can in order to get them to do work. So there's clearly now, it's not true of all, about maybe half of the firms, half of their franchisees, half of them typically raise the wage along with the minimum, just exactly what the minimum is. But there are some others that maintain a differential over that minimum. And that's a challenge. It's an empirical challenge, I think, to what exactly the appropriate theory is for thinking about the labor market in the context of low-wage workers.
Oh, thank you very much. If it's possible to tackle the questions that you have discussed before, like discrimination, for example, using that MAC wage index, or are these workers too homogeneous?
Well, you know, that's it. That's a very interesting question, because clearly inside of a McDonald's restaurant, workers will be paid more or less the same for doing the same things, regardless of their race or sex. But there is an interesting question about whether or not the ownership of the restaurant matters for what wage rates would be like. And that's hard to study because we don't have any easy way to find out who the owners are and what there's a group of McDonald's that's owned by African Americans, and they actually have an association where they present their case for those kind of specialized franchisees. I would love to know if there was any differences in the pay, but there's no easy way to find out the answer to that. So those are the thing about pay differences is that sometimes another thing that's happened, I think this is a big change in labor economics, is there's now, it used to be we would think of differences in pay based on the person. In other words, either based on the fact that you have more experience or more training or more schooling. These would be factors associated with the individual and would affect your pay. It's now pretty clear that there are, and what I just described about the McDonald's restaurants is a good example. It's now pretty clear that there are firm effects. In other words, some companies or establishments have pay premiums that are independent of what the quality or the characteristics of the worker happen to be. This is a little bit way of saying that your pay is really determined in part by who you work for, but also by what your skills are that you bring to the job. That's new. The focus on individual firms and what those individual firm effects are is quite new, and it's a result primarily of the fact of the data that we have available. So it's now possible in many countries to obtain data that link employees with firms. And that was especially true in the Nordic countries early on, but it's now true in the US as well as some other countries. So that's another, so that then raises a whole set of questions, which is what if it's not human capital that's causing pay differences, it's differences across firms. What exactly about the firms is it that's causing those differences? Now, I bring that up because in principle, if you wanted to explain labor market discrimination, you could find labor market discrimination across firms, but not within firms. So it could very well be that some groups have jobs in the firms that don't pay very well, and other groups have jobs in the firms that do pay very well. And that creates then a gap, which is hard to explain by the characteristics of individuals in the labor market. So that's a quite recent development. I think that will continue as more data are available, and probably we'll learn a little bit more. I think the goal is to learn more about those kinds of structures of payments. But it is kind of sort of an odd thing to say, that who you work for determines your pay in part. I think everybody actually knows that's true. If you get a good job, you should stay in it. Don't move. If you have a bad job, you should definitely move.
That's so true. So true.
Thank you.
So our next question is from the audience. It's from Diana Mikhalina. She's a PhD and an associate professor at the International Economics Department in the Yuri Fedkovich-Chernivtsi National University in Ukraine. She says she'd like to ask, what are the most significant impacts of the current war in Ukraine on the world labor market, if anything can be highlighted?
Well, that's a very good. Well, first of all, let me say to our Ukrainian friend, the support for Ukraine in the U.S. is very substantial. I haven't seen anything that's united people in the United States as much in recent years as the feeling that the Ukrainians have been put upon, and that they're doing their best to try to fight the good fight. Let me just say that. Now, let's come to one of the things that that's very difficult to study is wars, and another one is strikes, and another one is unemployment. So we leave all those topics to labor economists, except wars are not something that we've really spent too much time on. I think right now, it's a little hard to say. I'll tell you why. The situation in the labor market in most developed countries, maybe in other countries too, is heavily influenced by the results of the pandemic. There is an example, in fact, for anybody who's interested, I throw this out. It's a potential for some research. There is a period in developed country history that is similar to what we currently have. And that's the period just after the end of the Second World War. The Second World War caused total mobilization in the developed countries, certainly in the US. So for example, there were no automobiles manufactured in 1943, 1944, or 1945. So if you find a Ford motor car, you might find a 1942. There aren't many of them. And you might find a 1941, and you might find a 1946, but you will not find a 43, 40. So for 3 years, there were no automobiles produced. That's just one example. The whole war effort, the whole country was turned into a war effort. And coming back out of that war was a very difficult period, and it's quite similar, only it was much more severe, but quite similar to what's happening now, at least in the US, and I think in Britain and some other countries. What's happened is that there's a mismatch between where workers are and what they do. And that mismatch has ended up causing all kinds of difficult problems. But just to give an example, in 1946, the American inflation rate was 18%. Our inflation rate now has been maybe around 9, not 18. The unemployment rate was below 4%, and real growth in GDP was negative -9%. So the end of the Second World War created a big vacuum where lots of things had to be changed and retooled. I think that's more or less what we have now, just not as extreme, because the pandemic was not anything like as bad as the Second World War. Second World War resulted in destruction, as well as in the US, there was no destruction, but we did sort of indirectly destroy a lot of what we did because we didn't have any technical change in the production of automobiles, for example, which normally would have occurred. So I think what we have is a disruption, and the Ukrainian war just adds to that disruption. So it's really, it's like, if there were a good time to have a war, this would not be it. This is a bad time because there's already too much in the way of disruption going on. Adding to the disruption is definitely not a good idea. I think it will prolong probably the adjustments we have to make, the war in Ukraine. What's most disturbing, of course, is how fast we can recover. By the way, one of the most interesting things, the origin of the interest in human capital, partly is a result of the fact that the European countries, which were so destroyed during the Second World War, managed to recover and recover pretty fast. And the general feeling was that in other words, the physical capital was destroyed, but the human capital was not destroyed. So the idea was that the human capital could be used to replace that physical capital, and you could come back more quickly. I mean, Japan, for example, Japan was basically a poor country prior to the Second World War. Then one of the things that all of the students, when I was a student, studied was the Japanese economic miracle. Japan went from being an underdeveloped country, which had a huge army and a big navy, to a developed country with no army and no navy to speak of, which has income levels that are the same as in the US or any developed country. So hopefully there can be a recovery, because hopefully human capital won't be lost, even though, at least from the photos we see, the physical capital is being destroyed. You know, and of course, any economist, the idea of waste to an economist is just horrid. It's the most horrid thing I can think of is waste. And the war is a perfect example of waste. So obviously we need to get it stopped, and then we need to have some recovery. So, who knows how that will happen? That's way above my pay grade, as they say.
Thank you for that. That's a difficult topic. So what about now moving to some more relaxing part of your research, which is the wine economics. So it's really interesting to know what do wine economists do. I saw, for example, you write about global warming.
Well, it's a funny thing that the wine is a hobby. When I started studying the economics of wine, it was a hobby. I mean, I didn't really, that wasn't my major effort. But then it kind of got out of control. Now there's the American Association of Wine Economists. They just had their annual meeting, by the way, and had a wonderful visit in the country of Georgia. So the Georgians, Armenians too, we know in Armenia that there is a winery that's 6,000 years old. It's been discovered in a cave. And so it's a very interesting subject. And when I first came to Prague, in fact, I still remember it because I remember visiting this little teeny town called Kumatice. I'd like to visit it again. And this was a vineyard town in Moravia that had, so it was the end of the Soviet period. But the thing about the Soviet period in Moravia was that the farmers were still allowed to make and keep some wine for themselves. They didn't have to sell all of it to the state co-op. And these farmers I immediately thought, you know what's going to happen here? These people are pretty smart. They had this little town, by the way, it's like a bowl-shaped little town facing southeast, perfect for a vineyard. When I looked at it, I thought, this if I were going to buy something in this country, that would be it. I'd like to buy a vineyard in the middle of that little bowl, because that's going to be where the best grapes are going to be produced. And I thought, I'll bet you that you could grow Pinot Noir and Chardonnay grapes here, and that would be, you could get a lot more money than you could for the grapes like Müller-Thurgau. Of course, now I was right, of course, and they do. Each year, in fact, I ask, a Christmas present I give to Stepan Ureta is a case of wine that's mixed Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. So that it has become, basically now you can buy wines that would be the equivalent of top wines. And I still remember teaching an econometrics course where we actually tried to figure out how good the grapes could be, how good the wines could be in the Czech Republic, based on what the weather was like. Even though the grapes had not been planted yet, so they were, the wrong grapes were there. But most people, the farmers knew the good ones. So I learned I only learned a few words of Czech, but I know, for example, the word vini, and I know even more important word, which is arkivny vin. This means vintage wine. Arkivny vini was the first thing I read. That and pivo, beer. I learned all those. I learned about 4 words. That's pretty much all you really need to have a good time there. So it was a pleasure for me, because I could use it in many cases to introduce myself to some aspects of economics that otherwise I wouldn't have understood. If you're interested, there's actually a podcast on Rob Stavens's site at Harvard, in the Harvard Environmental Project, where I did a podcast with him, and a lot of it is about wine primarily, but it's especially about climate change in wine. That's one of the hot issues in the wine world, is exactly what's climate change is going to do to what people can grow and where they can grow it. So it's a kind of it's a pleasure, and of course you get to drink some of the results. It is true, when you go to a meeting of the American Association of Wine Economists, there is wine at lunch, which is not the normal meeting operation. Apparently, Georgia was a great place to visit. People were incredibly friendly. The impression everybody got was a really good one, and the Georgians were very welcoming, and got good support from the organization. So maybe I didn't go to that meeting, but it sounds like a lot of Russians are trying to go to Georgia too, but I don't think it's for the wine.
Thank you. Thank you so much for covering both the actual and difficult topics and the relaxing ones.
I think we have time for one more question, if you don't mind. So it's a question that's top of mind for many of our students, and that's, what would be the direction that you would send them towards when they're choosing a research topic in labor economics right now?
That's a very good question. I personally think the area that I would try to work in, it's not easy to work in, is the core. A lot of what labor economics is built around was core economic models where it was assumed that there was perfect competition in the labor market. So in technical terms, it means supply curves were perfectly elastic to firms. I think we've learned that that's not really true, and that there's failures of competition in the labor market that it would be very useful to try to shed some light on. It's not easy to do. I wrote one paper with Alan Kruger where we studied explicit links or failures of competition. These were franchise no poaching agreements. So a lot of people don't know this, but in the US, until recently, this has changed, by the way, probably I think as a result of this paper, what we did was to study how the no poaching arrangements worked. And I would love to know whether they have such agreements in Europe too, but they're gone now in the US. Generally speaking, franchise companies in the US have to provide some information about their model franchise. So we could study that. And we found, so here's what surprises people. Let's say that back in 2018, you worked at a McDonald's restaurant, and then you quit your job and you apply to work at another McDonald's restaurant. The first question when you applied online is going to be, have you worked for another McDonald's restaurant in the last 6 months? If you said yes, they automatically rejected you. In other words, the franchisees were not permitted to hire anyone who had worked in the franchise somewhere else. And it wasn't just them. We then studied franchise agreements, not all companies, but almost 60% of franchise companies had written into their franchise agreements these no poach agreements. The Attorney General of the state of Washington decided these were illegal, and he decided he was going to pursue them. And so almost every one of the companies now has eliminated these no poach agreements. But the simple, so that's explicit. That's explicit failure of competition. But there's also just upward sloping supply functions to firms, and as a result, some monopsony. I think that's probably these are the most interesting areas to work on right now, is to try to expand labor economics to make it look a little bit more like the non-competitive behavior you see as being considered common in the product markets by people who work in industrial organization. So I would say that it's not easy to work on. So it's hard to get data. A lot of times it's impossible, in fact, to make any headway. But I think that's probably the area where both explicit and non-explicit competition. I would be fascinated to know whether or not the McDonald's restaurants in Europe have written into their franchise agreements these no poach clauses, because we've eliminated them in the US, but that's because we could find out what they were. I don't know if that's I don't know that anybody even knows whether they have that situation. There are a lot. Germany and France both have lots and lots of McDonald's restaurants. I don't know whether they have these kind of agreements or not. Anyway, the suppression of competition. You know, I'm hardly the first labor economist to be interested in this topic. The first one that we really talk about is Adam Smith. In The Wealth of Nations, the famous book that a lot of people think of as their origin of economics, there's no discussion of product market competition, but there's several pages of discussion of labor market competition. And Smith basically points out that wherever employers gather, they're always discussing a kind of tacit collusion to suppress wages of workers. That was in the 18th century in Scotland that he's talking about, I guess. So this has been going on for a very long time, and we just have to catch up with Adam Smith. That's my current view. Catch up with let's get as far as Adam Smith was.
Well, thank you so much. And I think we can find that information about the McDonald's contracts, at least in the Czech Republic. I'll find that for you, Orley. I promise.
That would be interesting if they have a requirement for disclosure. That a lot of places don't.
No problem. We're on it. So also, thank you so much for joining us in general today. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and answer our questions. I know we could have talked forever because there's so much to ask you about, but we really value your time. And I also want to thank everyone else who joined us today and for your excellent questions. Before we sign off, we just want to let everyone know that the Foundation will be inviting a variety of speakers to our distance learning program series, including business leaders, university professors, and government officials to share their insights and expertise on topics we cover in our courses. These seminar series will be open to CERGE-EI students, to our professors, administrators, and staff, and to our partner institutions. So stay tuned for our next call in November. Thank you so much, Orley, and see you soon.
My pleasure.